Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Zoom event, Dropping Old Facades, Historic Imagery in a Modern Context here at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. My name is Dana. I'm with the Development Department, and this is Emma Reber. And we're going to do a few housekeeping points before we start our discussion before we just start a discussion. So we are recording right now so that we can send this discussion to you all later on and then we're also uploading it to YouTube for future use. So if you would not like to be recorded, you can, turn off your video so your face won't be out there. And then please, everyone should mute themselves just so we don't have a lot of competing interference with background noise. We took a little bit of time to talk through this sort of possibly like challenging, challenging topics. And so I am so happy and excited to introduce two of my colleagues here at the Cathedral who are going to walk us through some of these interesting topics and imagery. One is Ruth Whaley, who's the Director of Public Education and Visitor Services, and Mother Eva Suarez, who is our Canon for Community Engagement here at the Cathedral. So please take it away. I can't wait to hear the discussion.
Great. Thanks, Dana. Hi, everyone. As Dana said, my name is Ruth Whaley. I'm the Director of our Public Education and Visitor Services Department. I'm thrilled to have you all with us here today. I'm going to speak first. And for my portion of this program, one of my goals is to shed some light on some problematic representations and omissions that we find in St. John the Divine's art and architecture. And one of the many reasons why we wanted to do this program and offer it to the public was to explore some real kind of additional transparency on this subject and kind of sharing that together as a community of people. Some people I know on this call are very familiar with the Cathedral. Others, this may be your first interaction with us. Everyone is welcome, kind of no matter what your comfort level is with this space and this community. And one of the things that we're hoping to work towards is a fuller understanding of our history, both the things that in 2024 can look problematic or complicated. The subtitle of this program is Historic Imagery in a Modern Context. So thinking through what we see, who's there, who's not there, who's included, who's not included, which is a big topic. We're not going to touch everything in the next, 40 minutes. But I've pulled a few examples that I think will kind of hopefully help spark some ideas, give us an idea of some of the things that we're talking about and thinking about. And maybe ultimately we'll all get some brainstorms of things for discussions of what we'd like to see in the Cathedral in the next year, in the next 10 years, in the next 100 years. A building like this should outlast all of us, and we want to think through how she continues to grow and evolve. And in order to do that, I think it's helpful to have some context about the space. As was just shared, please feel free to drop questions or responses in the chat to help this kind of flow smoothly. I'll just be the only one with my mic on for right now, but feel free to use the chat if that's comfortable for you. I'm going to speak first, and then Mother Suarez will speak, and then we'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end as well. So if you'd rather ask your question out loud, you'll have an opportunity to do that. The other kind of best practice that I'm going to mention for the program for us as a group is to reference something Dana mentioned, which is that this is a complicated subject. It stirs up a lot of passion, which is fantastic. And we'll ask that everyone keep in mind that we're presenting with the best information that we have available to us. But please kind of we'll ask everyone for each other, for the presenters, to just give all of ourselves the benefit of, assuming best intentions. And I think that will help us feel like a productive conversation. You know, we all bring our own reactions to art and architecture when we see it. We all have our own experiences. So pay attention to how something might make you feel or not feel. And it might help further kind of spark ideas and brainstorms. I am going to be presenting images here. And I'm happy to share some of these as the recording gets sent out after the fact, but they're all photograph images. So there won't be any text on the screen that you'll need to follow along. Okay, great. Fantastic. So let's hop in. Okay, great. Perfect. Wonderful. So I thought we could start with some context about the beginnings of the construction of the cathedral, just to place us briefly in time. So cathedral construction began in 1892. And what we see here are some of the earliest photographs that we have of this construction time. So it helps us get a sense of the world that we're living in when the cathedral is starting to be built. The land and existing structures were purchased from the Leake and Watts Orphan Asylum. Okay. And this is what some of that land looked like in the late 1800s as the cathedral construction was starting. There was very little industry up here. There was King's College, which became Columbia University, and St. Luke's Hospital or Mount Sinai Hospital. But times were changing very, very quickly in New York City. This is a view from Morningside Park, looking up the hill at the cathedral, and you can see St. Luke's Hospital there as well. For those of us where it's been a little while since we've studied our state history or studied kind of New York City history, a few things that are going on while the cathedral construction is getting started. It's the Gilded Age, it's World War I, it's the Progressive Era. So there's major transformations happening in population, industry, wealth, a few smaller items. New York City is being consolidated into 5 boroughs. The Newsies strike is happening in 1899. So 7 years into cathedral construction, the Newsies go on strike. The New York subway is opening in 1904. So just a couple of things to kind of plop us into history so we can get a sense of what's going on when the decision makers were putting things together to help design this space. Some of you may be very familiar with the cathedral, so I apologize if this feels like something you're already very familiar with, but I know not all of us are. So I wanted to give us a brief look at the bird's eye view of the cathedral, and we're going to revisit small portions of this throughout the talk. So this is the cathedral from a bird's eye view, right? We'll be talking a little bit later about the chapels, which are on the right side of your screen towards the east end of the cathedral, as well as pointing out some of the stained glass windows that are on the western half of the cathedral or in the nave. So when the cathedral was being built, when we're talking about the turn of the 20th century, the first topic that I wanted to chat about with this group was really about this idea of an American cathedral, which was a really strong centering focus for this cathedral and other large churches like it, particularly in the Episcopal tradition at the turn of the 20th century. And we see that example in a few different ways in this building and on this campus that I wanted to share with you all. One of my favorites that jumps out at folks is a little bit startling. You don't expect to see it, but this is in our ambulatory, which is the walkway around the high altar. There is a bronze rendering of the Declaration of Independence, which was donated by the Daughters of the American Revolution and given to the cathedral, and it is bolted into the stone. You know, it is part of the wall of the building. So making a very clear statement about the identity of this building and trying to help craft what that means. We're kind of exploring what that means. We're playing with different ideas. And this is right there in bronze, and it's right at eye level. You can't miss it if you've had a chance to visit. It's in the wall of the ambulatory. You can take a look at it. Another way that we see them playing with this this identity of an American cathedral and working through what that means is in some of the stained glass windows. So there are 2 window bays that are directly opposite one another. One is the American History Bay, and one is the Military History Bay or the Armed Forces Bay. These are both being designed and put in place just during or right after World War I for a bit of framework there. This is the American History Bay, a portion of it, not the full window. we see things like the Louisiana Purchase, the inauguration of George Washington in these, I'm looking at these large images. There's the signing of the armistice is in the upper right corner, and returning from the Spanish War. So even in just this quick snapshot, we're seeing American history in large ways told through military efforts, although not exclusively in the American History Bay. Different window. That's military history or armed forces. There's an interesting overlap happening between the two, for sure. In the military history or armed forces bay, we see things like Valley Forge. We see the battle of surrender at Saratoga, things like that. Interestingly, we can also see in this image on the left side, we have two smaller figures. Those are Grant and Lee that are presented sort of side by side there in the window. And so this window is dedicated entirely to memorializing and honoring the armed forces of the US military, with a few kind of historical figures that are not part of the US military also thrown in. Again, kind of connecting this idea of what it means to be an American institution that's still very much coming together. And it's interesting to think about these things, how we might do them differently today, right? What we see happening, the decisions behind these things that we're privy to 100 years later, and the questions that are still left unanswered, to be honest. You know, there's things I would so love to know that we don't know, and we may never be able to find out, but we can piece some of the puzzle pieces together. Another kind of fascinating American identity moment that we're getting here is in what's the motherhood window. So it's a window dedicated to mothers, honoring mothers. We have Hannah on the left here, and Helena, right? Kind of pillars of Christian motherhood. And directly beneath them, I can't show them in one image, but directly beneath these two, we have George Washington with his mother. And we have Abe Lincoln with his mother. Just fascinating. And it creates a very clear parallel that they're drawing, right, between these mothers. Something that I find really interesting is that the mothers of Samuel and Constantine are named. They're named in the windows. We know who they are, right? These mothers are not. These are women as mothers, not necessarily women as individuals. That's a subject for a whole other talk, but it's something to keep in mind because it's part of this same complicated history story, right? These are women shown as mothers, not necessarily as historical figures in their own right. Something to keep in mind. Sticking with our friend George Washington, this is a separate building on the campus. This is Synod Hall, and we're looking at the front facade of Synod Hall, right? In the front portal, you can see there are three figures on either side and one in the center that are sort of at eye line, level with the door. Right? And they're symbols of 7 Christian rulers, right? The epitome, the pinnacle of Christian rulers. And in the very center is George Washington. Directly above George Washington is the story of Jesus. Drawing a pretty firm parallel between the two. This was really common trope in church architecture at the turn of the 20th century in the United States. We see it over and over and over again. And here it is at the cathedral, just something to think about. We'll transition now a little bit to some of the representations that we see, the erroneous representations of peoples in the cathedral, because part and parcel with this identity of what it meant to be an American cathedral at the turn of the 20th century, what it meant to be an American church at the turn of the 20th century, means that in the artwork, particularly indigenous peoples are often misrepresented in lots of different ways, either through sort of a unanimous kind of blanket statements or through just a complete kind of lack of understanding of how different groups of people might be dressed or might interact with others. And I have a few examples to kind of bring that home so we all are kind of on the same page about what I'm talking about, right? I'm going to be, oh, and I'll say as well, I'm going to be sharing some of these images, not to feel sort of sensationalistic, because I think that there's a tendency towards that of like, oh, I can't believe they did that. But so that we're having kind of a frank conversation. And so in the interest of us having all the same information and looking at the same imagery together. So I just wanted to be clear that that was sort of the motivation behind showing a few of these images one after another so that we all kind of have a shared sense of what it is that we're talking about. So a few of these kind of erroneous representations that we see. I mentioned that in American art, right, a large population that has kind of suffered this misrepresentation are indigenous peoples or Native American groups, right? Here's two examples that I wanted to pull out. On the left side, this is a very small sculpture, but it's at eye level in our baptistry. And our baptistry was donated by the Stuyvesant family, which were a really important family in New Amsterdam when this, the original colony was being founded. And so on the left there, we have a figural representation of Peter Stuyvesant, and he's shown trading with a Native American person who's holding a beaver pelt. That Native American individual is wearing a headdress from the Plains tribes. So none of the Lenape or Lenape peoples living in this area at the time would have been dressed like that. But when they were forming the baptistry, there wasn't necessarily an understanding and being accurate to that. There was an interest in showing them as sort of like a classic, easily recognizable Native American figure. And that was sort of the only goal that we see in reality here. On the right side, this is in the American history window. Captain John Smith has a prominent place. Next to him is an unnamed woman, but presumably is Pocahontas sort of kneeling next to him, not shown standing next to him, or there's no sense of partnership here. They're both together, but there's a real power disparity happening in how they're being shown in this window. And she's also, she's not named, and that's important to keep in mind, right? She's not being given her own identity in this picture. She's sort of a subordinate or easily substituted out for potentially somebody else. A few other examples I wanted to show folks. This is the Missionary Bay, which is particularly complicated window on this subject in a few different ways. But there's a few kind of on-point examples that I wanted to share with this group. When we're talking about misrepresentation, right? On the left side, or the left lancet, as we refer to them in stained glass, in the bottom left kind of half image along the left outside border, right? Looking kind of right here, you guys can see my pointer. We have a priest, a Jesuit priest, who is a missionary to what was then called the Huron Mission in the 1600s, what European colonists were calling New France, but he was working with the Wyandot peoples. The Huron Confederacy is what it was sort of anglicized to down the road. So this native person that this Jesuit priest is working with, we have an identity of the group of people. We know he would have been a Wyandot person because that was who this Jesuit priest worked with. However, similarly, he's in a completely inaccurate headdress because that headdress is worn by Plains Indians, not by folks of the Huron Confederacy or the Wyandot peoples. Fascinatingly, if you kind of go almost in the opposite corner, if you go in the right lancet and the right side, this half circle here, right? It says Las Casas. This figure was a Dominican friar. I believe he was a bishop in what is now modern day Mexico. And he is working with native populations who are wearing single feather headdresses, which is what the Wyandot people traditionally wore and still wear today, is single feather headdress. The Aztec populations probably had very elaborate multi-feather headdresses. So you have both representations here, and they're inverted almost perfectly in a way that is so bizarre to see 100 years later with a better understanding of the groups of peoples that we're talking about. So it's not that we had one image of a Native person and we used it for everything. We have different images of Native peoples, but sort of almost seems like randomly chosen because you have both ideas, but they're in almost a perfect swap position. So it's interesting to think about. And it's one of those kind of questions I don't imagine I'll ever be able to get answered, but would love to know how that happened. What was the conversation? I'll tell you now, I don't have the answer to that question. So in a little bit, please don't ask me because I'll disappoint you. I don't know why it was the way that it was. But I think it's still important to see that it's there and to see that it's inaccurate in the representation of these peoples. More broadly speaking, there is a really important othering that happens in stained glass windows because you have this visual literacy. You're telling an entire story through an image. So often that image gets boiled down. And what happens there, right, we see it in lots of different artwork, is when something gets condensed down like that, a lot of time it falls into a stereotype. Right? So briefly, I have just two images that I found here. The one on the left is St. Clair, and she's defending Assisi from Middle Eastern population of unnamed representation, but they're holding like a scimitar sword with their curly shoe. So we're putting together lots of different images that wouldn't actually all be together on one person. For the sake of just showing that she's fighting probably a Muslim soldier, right? So we've got different things coming together to make that come together. On the right side is David Livingstone, who is also a missionary, and he's doing missionary work throughout Africa. And so we have this kind of gray, what they would have called dusky complexion, we see in a few different places. This is one example where you can see it very clearly, but you can see it in other spaces throughout the cathedral, and it's a kind of trope of just othering, of showing that this native population that Livingstone's working with is other from Livingstone and the folks that might make up the main body of the cathedral at the time, right? So we see that happening throughout. And one of the goals of this program was to point out and like specifically identify, like, this is a problematic representation. This is an inaccurate representation. And likely happened as a form of shortcutting to try to get to the point of the story as quickly as possible. And so we can think now, how can we get to the story without othering populations that don't need to feel that way and don't need to be misrepresented in the glass and the stone in front of them? Great. Chatting a lot. I know I'm throwing a lot of information at folks. If there's questions or observations, I'm just going to remind you, you're very welcome to use the chat or let it sort of percolate, and we'll come back to it at the end if more questions pop up. So, kind of additional topic that we wanted to talk about that I mentioned at the start is thinking about who's not represented, right? I've made a point of showing representation that's inaccurate, but who's not here in the windows? And one of the windows that I wanted to show folks is the sports bay. That's some of the images from the sports bay are what we're looking at now. The sports bay has a lot of people showing different athletic sports, but almost none of them are specific individuals. So they could be anybody. They could look like anybody. They could be men, women, they could be any color. They could represent the world. What we see here are a lot of people that look very much alike, even though they're not showcasing specific individuals who might need to look a certain way. They could be anybody. But what we're seeing is kind of a classic example of an opportunity that was missed to be more representative of the world and to show a wider variety of peoples doing sports, which is something the whole world shares. Similarly, the only historical image of a Black woman is in the American History Bay. And it is, here, I've got an image of it here, is Lincoln delivering the Gettysburg Address. Right? And you can see she's there with her child, presumably sort of crouched behind Lincoln. And this is one of the most direct references we get to the Civil War in the cathedral. So we saw that there was Grant and Lee in one of the earlier windows, but we don't have a significant telling of the Civil War story. But one of the medallions is Lincoln at Gettysburg. And so this is kind of one of the very few looks into the Civil War that we get, which is interesting to see. And if we were telling the Civil War story or the story of slavery in the United States, I feel pretty confident that we would craft something with a little bit more power for the enslaved peoples who worked to self-emancipate and free themselves than the story that this image tells, right? Which is Lincoln sort of standing up in front of this person. What we have in the construction of the cathedral is a really fascinating time because there's really strong interest from the leadership of the cathedral at the time, the designers, the architects, the religious leaders, to be very inclusive. So I've been pointing out areas where it's not been inclusive, but we have evidence that they were working very hard in their own time and in their own context and in their own way to be inclusive and to be a very open, welcoming, accepting place. So we've got some kind of interesting motivations at play. And you can see this interest in being really inclusive in a few different ways. And I've pulled out just a handful to kind of demonstrate what I mean when I say that. One of the ways that they were working towards being very inclusive was in the organization of the chapels, which are in a horseshoe shape around the east end of the cathedral. And the chapels were dedicated, they're called the Chapels of the Tongues, and they were dedicated to the 7 most prominent immigrant groups coming into New York City at the turn of the 20th century, coming in through Ellis Island. Ellis Island, interestingly enough, opened the same year that construction started at the cathedral, which was 1892. So these two kind of institutions were really working in tandem in a lot of these social justice ways, right? And so the builders and the religious leaders of the cathedral had that very much front of mind and wanted to be a space where folks were welcomed. And so we have different chapels dedicated to the different immigrant groups coming in through New York City, wanting folks to have a landing space there. Another area where we can see the interest in being more egalitarian, being more accessible, being more opening, is that they chose not to install pews in the cathedral. Traditionally, going back centuries, pews were often purchased by wealthy families, the pews up towards the front. And that was where that family sat. That was their pew. They gave a donation to the church and they got themselves a pew. The leadership here didn't want to have that in their own time. And I would argue they probably didn't want to tempt future generations to be able to fall into that. So they said, no pews. I'm not going to do pews. So we put out rows of chairs for every service, every event. And so if the chairs aren't there, it's just a big open space. This is a brand new image because, as many of you may know, our chairs are brand new. We're very excited about them. So we have brand new, very lovely chairs. You're getting a snapshot of them here. They're lovely. They're very comfortable. They're not pews, so they move. And you can't purchase a section up front close to the priest, close to the altar for you and your family. The option's not there. And the reason for that option not being there is because the original leadership kind of had no interest in it. So we see this this kind of push-pull throughout this whole conversation, right? of this conversation that we're all having, but also just this topic in general. You see this push-pull, just sort of fascinating. There has been, I would argue, pretty significant effort to include more visual representation of being more inclusive in visual representation in the last many decades, right? One of those that we see, the National AIDS Memorial came into the cathedral, I believe it was 1985. It was in the mid-1980s. And that's a permanent representation in the cathedral. It's the National AIDS Memorial, a group of people that historically would have been excluded from spaces like St. John the Divine. This cathedral leadership said, nope, everybody's welcome here. We're going to set up a permanent memorial space for folks affected by HIV/AIDS. Right. There's also been efforts with contemporary art, which Ava is going to speak more about. As the Canon for community engagement, she has a better understanding of the motivations behind that, and she's going to share a little bit more about that as well. They've also taken advantage of the opportunities that we have for structural inclusion. So talking about the actual framework of the building, this is the parapet, which is a railing that goes across the front of the high altar, and it has different individuals from each century. And so we're kind of looking at it. The 1400s is on the far right, and then the 20th century is on the far left. And so we have figures like Christopher Columbus is on the far right, representing the 1400s. In the middle, we have figures like William Shakespeare and George Washington. And then when it came time to fill in the pedestal for the 20th century, you know, they got a committee of folks together, pick the one person to represent the 1900s, and they had a hard time. It's, I think, more difficult than they perhaps anticipated. And they picked a committee of people. They picked 4 people to represent the 20th century. So those 4 people are Dr. King, Albert Einstein, Susan B. Anthony, and Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi. So you see them taking advantage of the opportunity where they could to broaden folks' understanding of who's welcome in the cathedral and to demonstrate that folks are included and safe there. So I'm going to pass the virtual mic over to Mother Suarez to talk a little bit more about that. But if you, again, we'll have time for questions at the end. So if you have more questions or thoughts about some of the things I've shared, we'll be here and we'll have time to talk more about it.
Thanks, Ruth. Thank you, truly. And we will have lots of times for questions because my portion of the program is much briefer, in part because I have to acknowledge that I joined this conversation at my own peril because we raise sort of the existence of all this problematic imagery, these omissions, sins of commission and omission. And I get to sort of chime in to say, and we don't actually now know the right answer. Times have shifted since we laid the cornerstone of this place and began to think about what goes into the fabric of this cathedral. And what felt progressive in 1892 can now feel dated. And so I have to say right out that we don't yet know the answer that's right for this place in the 21st century of how we solve the problem of these problematic images that are part of our fabric. I'm going to share sort of 3 things that we have been doing and share it under the blanket of humility, because I'm so struck that Ruth ended with, here's all the ways that, or some of the ways, there's many more, that the builders of this place were trying to be progressive and challenge what a cathedral might have looked like within the Episcopal tradition before the construction of this place. And so I think it helps us when we have this conversation to have a healthy dose of humility, because this is what progressivism looked like, right, for our founders. And so our attempts to right those wrongs might be similarly blinkered and short-sighted. Changes that we make now might be revealed in a century's time to have been short-sighted, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to interrogate who we're meant to be. And I think it's so fascinating that this was built to be an American cathedral, because that's been a contested identity every step of the way from 1892 to now, and will continue to be a heavily contested space. So I'm grateful for the ways that the cathedral has consistently interrogated and updated its identity. One of the helpful things of being perpetually unfinished, right? Which is another one of our identities. So I'll say, if you could go to the next slide, Ruth. Great. This is Our Lady of Ferguson. So I'll say our first tack here at the cathedral is that new pieces, new installations, new donations find a home and a visible home. So Ruth showed the window of Abraham Lincoln with the kneeling freed woman behind him, or questionably freed. We're not given enough of an identity of this woman to know what it's meant to fully represent, until Our Lady of Ferguson was was donated to us, that was the only image of a Black woman in the cathedral. And now we have a Black woman as the Mother of God. And so this is Our Lady of Ferguson. She is meant to commemorate victims of gun violence, particularly gun violence enacted by the state. You have the traditional Marian imagery, the light blue, the red, and the beating Sacred Heart, speaking of the ferocity of Jesus's divinity and humanity, and making us question our own humanity, living in a time when such violence persists, and persists particularly against Black and brown people in this country. And I think one more slide of a newer addition to the cathedral. This is a Keith Haring altarpiece in the Chapel of St. Columba. It's one of 3 casts of this altarpiece, I believe, that is one of Haring's last, if not his last, piece of work before he died of AIDS. So here at the cathedral, new pieces, more diverse artistic voices are finding a home, different representations, pieces like Our Lady of Ferguson, pieces like the Haring altarpiece, pieces like Christa, a feminized version of Christ on the cross in the Our Savior Chapel, raising, potent questions and controversial questions. Christa was put in place in, I believe, the late 70s, and then removed for decades. So this process always invites a lot of conversation and a lot of emotion. So again, just to summarize, we try to have new pieces find a home at the cathedral. We are also asking ourselves, what's in storage? What has been given to us and sort of put in a crate, left in the crypt, that needs to come out for us to live into our mission as a place of prayer for all people, particularly in New York City. So, for example, we have just surfaced the Armenian Kachkar. It's a cross image from Armenian Christianity that was given to the cathedral to serve as a memorial to the Armenian genocide. So just a couple weeks ago, it was Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day. And we not only brought the Kachkar out of storage into the cathedral, but had a liturgical moment where the primate of the Armenian Church of the Eastern Coast was here, along with members of their choir, members of their clergy, and we were able to explore, what does real ecumenical liturgy look like, where we have pieces fully from both traditions in different languages, where neither one of us sacrifices our different theological claims, but try to come together to celebrate the things that do connect us and commemorate the lives lost in, this important and often overlooked piece of global history. And similarly, coming out of storage this year will be other memorials. We have an Auschwitz memorial that has too long been in storage. And so I think just bringing these things up makes people want to come here who wouldn't otherwise feel either invited or called to come to this space. So I think it's a great opportunity for us to think about the ways that representation leads to relationship, and the ways that if we fail to represent certain people at the cathedral, we do so at our peril, because we lose the opportunity in some ways to have a relationship with them. Ruth told me once a story of a visiting public school where the boys were so excited to see the sports bay, to see people playing soccer, to see people playing baseball. These were, I think, Dominican kids, and they were struck and mentioned that all the people playing those sports were white. And we miss, even the simplest opportunities to show people who they are, and that who they are is beloved of God. And finally, we are looking at who is setting an example in this work and in this space. And we're trying to build relationships with those institutions. One is St. Paul's Cathedral in London, which is full of colonial monuments, as they would describe them. And they have put together a committee, and without really much public debate at all, have begun to simply remove images from the cathedral that to them are in honor of a heritage of violence that they no longer want to celebrate. And so that's one way. And we have reached out to ask them, how did you put that committee together? We're trying to have conversations to learn from their process. And another place that we want to be in better relationship with and learn more about how they've done this work is the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., my home cathedral where I was ordained. They had a Confederate window, and I believe it was almost a decade of internal dialogue as an institution, public dialogue with the community, and then ultimately finding a new artist to replace those panels and figure out what, you know, when you take something out of the fabric of a place, when you take a window out, you can't just leave a hole where it used to be. You have to put something in. So as we sort of turn towards Q&A, questions that I have for myself and for anyone who cares about this issue is, you know, what is too offensive to remain? And how do we find that out? How do we decide that? Who's a part of the conversation? I can't think of a good or a quick answer. Like there were too many expressions of commission and omission for Ruth to count, but I was struck, I'd never noticed Oliver Wendell Holmes in the American history window, the great dissenter, champion of the First Amendment, and the majority opinion writer in Buck v. Bell, which gave the government the right to legally sterilize people and was the legal groundwork for the American eugenics movement. Like a hero and a villain in one man, a modern marvel for a lot of progressive judicial folks, and, you know, the holder of a really rough piece of American history. And so I think as Americans, as New Yorkers, as Christians, it's a really potent question with no right answer of who helps us recognize that none of us are perfect and that all of us are capable of good and ill, and who has done too much that to have them represented in this space is okay. Like, I would imagine that there are folks who struggle to see Christopher Columbus, even if he does share an area with Gandhi and Abraham Lincoln. So who decides who's too offensive to remain, or do they remain with context? And once things come out, what other things go in? So this also raises the number one question for us is, how are we a cathedral in the 21st century to New York now? And so if Nordic people, the people of the East in the Chapel of St. Savior, the British Isles, Italians, Spaniards, and French and German were the dominant immigrant groups at the time of our construction, what are the dominant immigrant groups now? And what does it mean to represent them? How do we bring them into that conversation? And how do we keep this place relevant and alive for anyone who might visit us? So those are the questions that we are beginning to openly struggle with, and I would love to hear your thoughts on. But that's just a word on what the cathedral is doing.
All right, so if anyone has questions, comments, concerns, even we are happy to take you, and we will like call on you. I think I see one already with Miss Marsha Raw.
Always questions.
I love it. No, go for it.
No, I'd say I had so many reactions. First of all, was a question on the Abraham Lincoln Gettysburg Address. He's talking to someone who looked to me like Frederick Douglass, and I just wondered who that was. It was a man with curly hair, large features, and he's on the same level. So I would wonder who that is. Somebody must know, in which case that window is politically correct and you don't have to be upset, right? The other thing is I'm struggling with this personally. Some of you, I guess none of you were around when we in the congregation, and I was a leader on this, I fought having Ezra Pound honored in the Poets' Bay. We were I was beside myself, to be really honest, because anti-Semitism is, of course, part of the church history, but Ezra Pound went way beyond what people normally do, and Bishop Grein agreed with us, and it didn't happen. So there I was fighting it, but it's like the late 20th century already. I don't think you really can do much about what's been done in the past. It's just our history. If you start doing it, you'd have to rename Kennedy Airport because he was a womanizer. You'd have to get rid of Washington Square because Washington had slaves. I mean, this is just our history, and we know what it. We should know what it is, but what we put in the future, and there are lots of things you can do in the base. You could do a lot of things with sculpture where there is, you could do tons, and so I think it's just not to get too upset. And I think what Ava said that was so true. I was actually going to say it. Anything we do now in 50 to 100 years, people will say, "Oh my goodness, look at what they did." Blah, blah. I mean, we don't know what it's going to be, but so I think you have to be kind of relaxed about it and know you can't. It can't be perfect. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcia. I can speak to your first question, which was about who's Abe Lincoln speaking to. And from what we know, it's described as an anonymous group of Southern Americans. So that's he's proclaiming, it looks sort of casual, but proclaiming the Gettysburg Address to an anonymous group of Southern Americans. So that's the extent of what we know about the artist's understanding of who Lincoln is talking to at the Gettysburg Address. And I saw someone's question in the chat about, apart from Washington and Lee, are there any identifiable figures of known American enslavers in Windows? There are. Like one we looked at, but I didn't point out, was Thomas Jefferson is the signing of the Louisiana Purchase. And so there's figures like that. It would take too long to I wouldn't be able to come up probably with a comprehensive list, but we can be confident that there are other examples throughout the cathedral.
Yeah, so I think Janet Abraham has her hand raised.
I just wanted to use this opportunity to give a positive shout out. I guess I'm not always in the loop when people are, I know I'm not in the loop when people are deciding what to display and where, but I was pleasantly delighted months ago when suddenly an Elizabeth Catlett sculpture appeared titled Glory. And I think that's a really wonderful work of art, very dynamic and important artist, something I often don't have the time to include, but I thought it was a major positive, and it just came as a complete surprise to me, but a good one. So thank you.
Yeah. Oh, can you tell us where that is in the cathedral if we want to?
I think it's in St. Columba, the Chapel of St. Columba. As you face the Keith Haring, it's over on the right, and it's just quietly appeared. As from my perspective.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay, so and we have a question from the chat. Who decided on the stained glass imagery? The board, the dean? Who was it?
Gosh, I wish I knew. I think it was probably lots of committees, to be honest. Like, they made decisions the same way then we do now in a lot of ways. Probably a lot of committees. We know a few examples where like the architects wanted to do something and then kind of went up and then fell into conflict with like the church leadership. So there was lots of back and forth between all sorts of different parties, I'm sure. But I wish I had a better understanding. I would love to read those meeting minutes. I think that would be fascinating. And that's a good project. If anyone's looking for a dissertation project, I'll set you up with the diocesan archives and we'll get you started, because it would be fascinating to know in more detail.
Ellen, yes.
I understand what an incredibly daunting task this is, but I think one of the things that might help is simply better curating what is there. So one of the things that came to mind with the sports bay is to have a short history of Jackie Robinson and what baseball was like before Jackie Robinson, so that it's understood that those windows were done at a time of injustice, but it has been rectified, and we acknowledge that person, Jackie Robinson, and of course, all of the other wonderful baseball players that have come up on the scene from then until now. But I think to just leave something without explanation is more problematic. But at the same time, I don't think we want to go bashing out stained glass windows. So we have to do something, and that might be a good middle ground.
Okay, so there's one question from the chat. There's a comment and then there's a question. Has the cathedral been in touch at all with the New York City committee, who was, maybe still is, doing some of the work to look at imagery in the public space of the city? Mother Suarez, have we?
I'm not familiar with them. Tyler, I'll take that, or Taylor, I'll take that under advisement and look them up. And I just want to just add that I think some of the points and questions raised so far have really spoken to the need for a process that we can unearth things in storage, amend signage, but whatever it is that we do to engage with this work, we never want to leave people wondering, like, how did they possibly make this decision? So I think it speaks to the real need for process.
Yeah, great. Okay, thank you. And then we have another question. Is John C. Calhoun anywhere commemorated? Do we know?
I don't know. I don't know. I'd have to do a deep dive. Nothing is coming to top of mind. I know there are some cathedral experts in the room, so if anybody has any, feel free to hop in. But nothing's coming to my mind right now. But I hesitate to say no finally, because there's a lot of there's a lot of detail in this building, so it's very possible I'm not thinking of it.
Ethan?
So as we were talking about removing stained glass windows, I was reminded of a year ago we visited cathedrals in the south of England and ended up at Canterbury. And a lot of the stained glass, that medieval stained glass, was destroyed during the Reformation, during the time of Cromwell. So some of the imagery that we saw in the stained glass windows strikes me personally as either quaint, like the sports bay. You know, who would have thought that that would end up in a cathedral? Because usually cathedral windows depict biblical scenes, but this is an American cathedral, so it's following a different.
It had to have one.
Yeah, Helene says it had to have sports. The people's reactions are very idiosyncratic. Being a lifelong pacifist, member when there was of the Episcopal Peace Fellowship, I find the presence of a military bay to be unsettling, at least. But then I contextualize it and say, well, that did happen. It was part of our country's history, and it was put in a post-war era. So in any of these things that we find disturbing and unnerving, I think have to be contextualized for people who are seeing them. And then the comment about how are people, oh, Marcia's comment, how are people going to react 50 or 100 years from now, is something that we should all keep in mind. So
That's where the humility comes very strongly.
Right. So the medieval stained glass in Canterbury Cathedral is lost forever, but new artwork gets put in, like the ferromagnetic sculpture by, what's his name?
Anthony.
In the crypt in Canterbury, there's a wonderful contemporary piece made of nails.
Made of the nails that were removed from the medieval parts of the cathedral.
Yeah. and it's a spectacular piece. So I'd love to see some of the items that are in storage taken out of storage. In fact, I wonder, maybe set up a guided tour to see what's in the archive, see what so that people who are interested can have a look and offer an opinion.
Go shopping in the.
Yeah, like you go shopping in your closet to find clothes you haven't worn. Okay, thank you.
All right. We have a discussion about city council going on in the chat, so please look for that. Do you, okay, sorry. Do you feel that contextualizing labels, if consistently applied, okay, sorry. Oh, it's okay. I just want to read the rest. Could distract from the spiritual purpose of the cathedral and reduce the structure and contents to just objects, historical and/or art?
That's a
So I
great
guess,
question.
yeah.
It's a great question. I think, and that's something what I'm work to keep in mind is that something like a contextualizing label, it doesn't have to be, etched in the stone. You try something out, you play around with it. This is a living building. And so you try different things to get to the goal that we're working towards. But also to say that, like, you have to really keep balance in mind. This is a sacred space, an active house of worship. And so there's a lot of priorities and a lot of different reasons that folks might be in the space and experiencing the art and the architecture. And so short of having, walls filled with contextual text, which doesn't serve anyone, you can't possibly answer each question. And so to try to balance that is a constantly changing and important task. It's a great question.
Yeah, we are always sort of discussing what needs its own sort of sign up, what can go on the digital tour. So a plug for Bloomberg Connects, please download Bloomberg Connects so you can visit digital tours that we upload and further descriptions than could fit on any piece of paper or plaque that we put in the bays. But we also have to ask ourselves, how much hurt is worth it? The retain and explain, I'm a big believer in that, but also it's been fascinating over the last, decade to see this argument play out in different ways across the country and to hear people's voices, particularly people of color who have not been able to always be heard in halls of power, say, like, no amount of explanation can undo the harm it does me to see this certain image. Thinking of perhaps something like the Teddy Roosevelt statue in front of the National History Museum. And so because we are not a museum, but an active house of worship, we can't just retain and explain if there are people who are coming to worship within our walls and feeling, grief and harm from images in our space. I'm grateful that we don't have as many, we have more sins of omission than commission. When I look around, there's a lot more that's missing than can be easily seen as minimizing, tokenizing, but there are a lot of voices that need to be heard in this conversation. And because we are an active house of worship, it's a lot more complex than it would be if we were just a museum. Marcia?
Yeah, the thing I just wanted to mention is there were a lot of more tapestries that were up for years along the bays. So I just want to put another plug for the bays. You have all that space and it's at eye level, where a lot of these stained glass windows, you really can't see what it is, except it's a little red, it's a little blue, and it's very beautiful. But we don't necessarily know what it is. I mean, some people know. Some people look at everything and read everything, but I never knew what was in St. James Chapel other than a lot of red and blue. And isn't it pretty? It was till I went to a lecture. But really, you could do a lot with sculpture and hangings of all sorts. that would more than overwhelm the details that are in the stained glass that nobody really can see. And when you go beyond that, there's the whole, you know, patriarchy and the language and all the stuff that we do when we worship that bothers people. And it doesn't bother me at all. So I'm not even sympathetic. It's like, get over it, you know, but I realize that's not, you can't do that. I can toss that out because who am I? But I really, again, the bays, you can do a lot. And that's where Our Lady of Ferguson is, in one of the bays. And it's one of the most powerful works of art that we've got. I've been so thankful. I have a copy of it up in my kitchen. I'm so thankful for it. It's just wonderful. So more of the same, please.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Marcia. I think that was our last question/comment. Thank you so much, Ruth and Mother Ava, for doing so much hard work and research and really hashing out how we want to talk about this. Thank you so much to our participants who are deepening their understanding and knowledge of the cathedral. We hope to see you here really soon. We have a lot of great events coming up, and we will look forward to the next Zoom so that so many people far and wide can be in conversation with us about difficult topics and hopefully more happy topics too. So we will see you all soon. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.